Hi, everybody. You know, it's a special thing when I have a guest because I don't have a lot of guests. But today we're talking about a topic that is so important and that I want you to stay and listen. And I actually want you to make a commitment to refer this to at least 2 other friends because we're in a place where kids are in a mental health crisis. And unfortunately, medication is always the thing that physicians, other mental health practitioners recommend first. And I'm not anti-medication. I am anti-medication as the first line of defense. Today, we have Erin Kerry, and she just wrote this amazing book that I want you all to go out and buy. It will be in the show notes, Live Beyond Your Label. And it isn't just about how we get labeled. It's actually a lot about her own personal experience of healing from being medicated as a teenager and a young adult, and how she's living an amazing life medication free. And how actually, I know about this, and we're going to talk about it, how she was given a lot of shopping cart diagnoses, is what I like to call, a lot of labels slapped on her, and how they really weren't true, and how that led her lovely parents, which is what you are, down rabbit holes that actually hurt her. And luckily she had a lot of, guidance, and there was a lot of spirituality and a lot of holistic health that came to her. So welcome. I hope that did it justice, but I'm so glad that you are brave enough to have this conversation, because it's a conversation that needs to be had, and no judgment against people who are on medication. This is really, let's think about it. Like, is your kid really happy and healthy? If they're not, and they're on meds, think about other things. And that's what this whole show is all about. So welcome, Erin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was about to say welcome to you. I'm used to that on the other side of the podcast recording. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I've been on Erin's show a bunch of times, and she's a health coach. And, I think this is, again, a beautiful thing. But in your book, Live Beyond Your Label, it's a blend of science, of faith, personal healing. Talk about walk us through, what happened to you, when, you were experiencing distress, and how did this come to be that your parents put you on medication? And then we'll talk about some of the alternatives, because that's what people want to know. Like, how did you get so healthy and well and mentally strong?
Yeah, for sure. And, I think your audience is going to be more familiar than most with some of the language that I'll use. But I do think, looking back, if we just go way, way back to infancy, right? I was a colicky baby. I had, according to my mom, we lived in a house where there was toxic mold. So I had mold exposure. I had constant ear infections. I was just a very irritable, fussy baby, according to her. She said I was 2 when my brother and sister were born. They're twins. She said they were taking care of twins with a 2-year-old was easier than just raising me until 2, because it was that difficult. And so I had a lot of physical health challenges. I ended up, when I was 18 months old, my lungs collapsed, and 75%, to the point where I had to, that's my earliest memory. I went to the doctor, and they, loaded me up on, I don't know if it's like epinephrine or whatever it is to get things going again. And it was terrifying. So I had asthma. I struggled to breathe. I had the mold exposure. I had constant strep infections, which is what I do believe led to some major what I would call psychoneuroimmunological challenges for me.
Yeah.
And so when I experienced, a big trauma when I was, it's so funny, we minimize our traumatic experiences, right? Because we're like, oh, people go through so much worse.
Don't we?
People go through worse. But when I was 9, I watched my grandpa die of anaphylactic shock in our front yard. And we were really close to my
Erin,
grandpa. We went
I'm
to
so
a buffet,
sorry.
and people with allergies, what this is like. He went to a buffet. He ate something that had been cross-contaminated with shellfish, which is what he was allergic to, and died in our front yard because that was the closest place they could go. And I watched the ambulance come. I watched them do the EpiPen. I watched them do CPR, all of these things, just sitting there frozen going, what is happening? And that sent me into PTSD. And I didn't know, we didn't know this was like, I mean, this happened in 1991, right? So
Yeah.
PTSD at that point was just for war veterans, if it was talked about at all. It wasn't for kids who
Yeah.
watched their grandpa die. And so I was experiencing flashbacks and some depressive symptoms that just culminated in depression in 8th grade. And I will say, even then, I was struggling. I found some old journals that I wrote when I was in 5th grade. I was struggling with chronic stomach issues after that. Like these journals I wrote, oh, I'm staying home from school again. They're giving me antibiotics. They're, you know, like my stomach hurts. I don't know what's wrong. And I'm sure these are all, again, physical manifestations of the complete overwhelm, the trauma that I experienced, the fact that my immune system was always working so hard to protect me, as I would phrase it now, working very hard to protect me, but came at the expense of how I was feeling, to where 8th grade, I was experiencing depression symptoms. I was also put on the birth control pill. We could talk about that, how that increases anxiety and depression for adolescent girls, which we know now with multiple studies. But I was put on the birth control pill because I was anemic. And it's like, well, let's just calm that cycle down a little bit, right? This is what they say, so that I can restore my iron levels again, all of that. Within a year, that caused my depression to really spiral. So there are a lot of contributing factors to my early adolescence and my struggle with depression. And it was more of the depression I experienced, it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to, you know, I didn't want to harm myself. I just wanted to go away. It was just overwhelm. It was complete. And then you factor in that I grew up in a home where my dad was a pastor of a church. And so I thought there was something wrong with me for being depressed and being sad, because that went against everything that I grew up believing faith-wise. Nobody talked about mental health in the 90s, in the early 90s.
No.
Nobody was talking about it. And so I just really, it internalized more labels for me, which is nobody understands me. I'm alone. There's something wrong with me. I'm broken, you know, all of these things. And that just, my parents saw that. They saw me suffering. And so, of course, after trying, they did try some, I think at one point I was on oil of oregano. I still remember this. I was taking oregano pills and I just kept burping up oregano. I don't remember why. It had to do with my immune system, I'm sure. But they took me to a therapist. They took me to a psychiatrist, and they medicated me with, the first thing I was medicated with was Zoloft. And I became extremely, my mom was just telling me this the other day. We were talking about this because, of course, the book is coming out. So we're processing all of these things together. And she said, I never knew how much you were struggling until you were put on the medication, and then you started cutting yourself. The medication increased my depression so much more than before. And it did turn into self-harm and self-loathing in a way that I had not experienced previously. And again, we know this in the research. This is what we know about antidepressants, especially in adolescence. It's not talked about, but
it's not talked about, but the research is right there, right? You know, can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
You said this so eloquently, like you talk about your trauma, like, this is what happened to me. Like, you know, you've done a lot of work on this, so it's not so activating. But like when you talk about your mom being aware that, you know, you had mold, she's now looking back and making that connection. She had no awareness at the time. Yeah. And so like from your parents' perspective, when you were going through this, you know, you were colicky, you were not easy, like you were more of a sad affect. Like what were some of the things that they saw even before age 9, right? Like, and then you had trauma. Yeah.
I'm glad you asked
about some of the physical. Yeah. I would love to see, because a lot of times I think this is multifaceted. When you have kids, like I had a kid who was, you know, bitten by a tick at 22 months. And so you get confused. What's normal? What's not normal? Yeah. And so like, but your parents were like, wait, I got twins that are easier than this girl. Like, you know, like, so they knew. So like go through some of those subtle signs that, as I always say, Steve Jobs says, we can only connect the dots looking backwards, right? So we're trying to prevent this right now. And everything Erin and I do is we are trying to bring you health. I don't want to hear no coulda, woulda, shoulda. I want to hear, now I know what my path is. This is so important for parents, because a lot of times we over pathologize and
Mhm.
other times we ignore. We don't need a
Yep.
label to take
Yep.
action. Let me say that again. We don't need a label to take action. We need signs of dysregulation. So what were those signs, under and overstimulated signs, that your parents now can make
Yep.
sense out of?
I am so glad you asked that, because that's a huge part of my story that even my dad recently was telling me. I mean, I'm hearing all these things now. I'm over 40, and I'm hearing my dad. He was speaking to a large group of people this summer, and he was telling my story in order to promote my book, which was very sweet of him.
Oh,
But he said there were times that it appeared that my head was about to spin around. Like it was almost like like I think he equated it to like an exorcism type of situation going on, because my moods would shift and I would have what we would see in a kid who, now you and I would say it's like a pans or pandas
yeah.
situation. But my
Mhm.
mood would shift and I would just get explosive with, crying, screaming. There's impulsivity there. At one point, we moved from California to Texas when the summer I was 9. So it was right before, it was in between 3rd and 4th grade, which for girls, that's always, there's some early puberty things happening too. But my mom tells this story that we were leaving my best friend's house and she had to physically drag, and I was a big kid. She had to physically drag me out of the house because I was screaming and kicking and crying like a 3-year-old would. So I
Yeah.
was having fits as a 9-year-old girl who,
Mhm.
I would say, my emotional intelligence, even as a kid, like my EQ was pretty high. Like I was very sensitive to everything all at once, but then everything would hit me all at once, right?
Mm.
That highly
You felt
sensitive.
things really strongly.
Yes. And so
Yeah.
I remember feeling and knowing I shouldn't be doing this. There's something wrong with me. Why am I acting this way? And I couldn't stop. It just exploded
Yeah.
outward. Or there were times, I was a reader. I would spend all day long in my room and I would crash. So this is what eventually, when I was 18, got diagnosed as bipolar disorder.
Mhm.
But I think it's definitely a dysregulated nervous system state. I would go from extreme fight or flight to extreme freeze. And there
Yeah.
was no in between. If there was, it would have to be dopamine driven, right? Like it would have to be with food, sugar. I ate a lot. I mean, at one point when I was 16, I ate 8 Boston cream pie donuts from Dunkin' Donuts in one setting at a church event. Like I showed up at church on Sunday, there were Boston cream pie donuts. I'm like, this is good. I'm gonna keep eating them. I had 8 of them. Like I just had this
It gave you a
insatiable.
hit, like an energy hit. Cause I remember,
Totally, totally.
on Erin's show, we kind of like, we're like, I think you're PANS. And just for people to know what PANS is, it's
Yeah, let's talk about
pediatric
that.
acute
Yeah,
onset neuropsychiatric syndrome.
yeah.
And it is an infectious or toxic trigger that
Mhm.
creates a misdirected immune response. The body
Yep.
starts attacking itself, and you have neuropsychiatric, neurocognitive symptoms,
Mhm.
things that could look like ADHD or bipolar or all these other
Mhm.
things. And I, like it's, when your dad says it was like a demonic possession,
Yeah.
these are words I've said about my own child with PANS.
Uh-huh.
Like
Yep.
there's like, oh, something comes over them and they're outside of their body. It's
Yes.
interesting, Erin, that you can remember that. And like you talk about not remembering some of the things when you had PTSD, and that's because that's your
Mhm.
brain trying to protect itself.
So
When you have
interesting.
PTSD, it tries to shut down
Mhm.
some of those visual activations. So you won't remember things. But
Mhm.
so changes swiftly in mood, big reactions,
Yes.
like and tantrums
Oh, yeah.
outside of developmentally normal, and
Yeah.
probably partly poor recovery too. Like when you had a
Oh,
tantrum. Yeah.
absolutely. Like, it was very hard to get back into a regulated state, and it would take a substance, and
Yeah.
as that progressed, it's funny, now I see these patterns, and I'm like, "Oh, that's why I turned to alcohol when I was in
Yeah.
college, because they put me on these drugs. They put me on Depakote and lithium and Seroquel and all these real heavy-hitting drugs that made me feel flat, made me feel out of my body, made me gain a lot of weight. Like, I did not feel like myself at
Yeah.
all, and so I discovered alcohol, and I was like, "Oh, well, that kind of that changes the way I feel. So I'm just going to keep doing that." So there are all these different substances. I would use sugar, carbs, alcohol. I mean, you name it. I did not do any. It's funny, knowing my brain, I was always terrified of hard drugs.
Yeah.
Like terrified. I actually went, I had a really bad experience with marijuana, which not many people know this. There is a gene for THC induced psychosis. And I have that gene. I know this now, didn't know it when I was, 20 years old and smoking or taking a hit off my friend's bong. So
Yeah.
that made me out of my mind for a week, and nobody could figure
It
out
happens
why.
a lot. People don't talk about it.
And
Yeah.
it creates mania. It creates diagnoses and labels. A lot of our labels come from substances. It comes from viruses, comes from toxin exposure, right? And so for me, one of the biggest parts of my healing journey was to unpack that and go, wait a minute. I don't know if I am this diagnosis I've been given. It helped me fit the, cascade of symptoms that are listed in the DSM, but it didn't really help me to know what to do with me or what to do when the moods hit. I've got to figure this out by myself. I've got to figure out on my own what's going to really help me, what's really going to help me stay regulated consistently. And I have been off, it'll be 11 years in December that I've been off all medications, and a little bit longer for the heavier hitting, like the Depakote, Trileptal, some of the mood stabilizers, longer than that, because you can't be on those to have kids. My oldest is 21, which is crazy. Then my 11-year-old, I had to get off right before him. Anyway, all to say, it was possible for me, but that was because I think those medications, while they were keeping me flat, they weren't treating the root. And I say that very cautiously, because I don't ever, say to anybody, get off your medication. It's going to be great, because it oftentimes makes things worse. I mean, when I got off my 5 milligrams of an SSRI, I struggled for a good month before I stabilized. And by struggle, I mean vertigo and these brain zaps that I had, and just feeling kind of out of my body for a while. So I never encourage anybody to go off a medication without a support team. But
in fact, you never titrate off. You never do any of that without the approval and support of your prescribing physician. And if you're looking to do that and your prescribing physician won't do that, your best bet is to find a functional physician, always a physician who can support you in that. And again, we're never saying no to medication. We're saying no to the first line of defense. And also, yes to figuring out what's going on. So you had this PTSD when you were 9, and then things got progressively worse, right? And your parents did absolutely, they wanted to follow their experts' advice, right? And you went from medication to medication. And just to clarify that, because I know the answer, you went from medication to medication because nothing was working.
Correct. And in fact, the more they bumped up my SSRI, the more hypomanic I became, to where I had a full-blown manic episode when it was right after I graduated high school. So, and I'd also gone on a crash diet. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting things. I do believe, nourishment, I'm so big on nutrition and getting the nutrients we need for our brains to function optimally. And I was in a major calorie deficit on swim team. And I think that spiked my hypomania, because it was my body trying to protect me. It was an adrenaline response.
Yeah. And, so many of the kids that I work with, I would say more than 70% are restrictive eaters for one reason or another, often sensory sensitivities. Sometimes it's OCD related to the food. And so I don't ever want to make anybody feel bad about not getting the nutrients in, but it is a misnomer that it's not quick and powerful. Nutrients, getting the right nutrients in, just like eating the wrong things. You go and have a Cinnabon, you're going to be feeling like doo-doo. I don't care who you are, right?
After the initial rush.
After the initial rush. But, and then you have your other side crash, but you go and have, brown rice, broccoli, and chicken, of course, with an amazing, beautiful, sauce in it with whatever you want to put in there. And you're going to feel very different. And I love that you talk about food as substances, because, what we do does make a difference. It's basic chemistry, absolutely. And so no shame, just empowerment that actually what you put in your body can have a really positive effect, right? We got to look at it as that. And it's not easy to change your diet, but so things continue to get worse. You're working with a therapist, you're stable enough in theory to go to college.
Oh, yeah, and actually what's so interesting is school-wise, I did great. I mean, I was an English major, I loved it, I could stay up, and maybe this was a little bit of hypomania, as they would call it, or an ADHD thing, who knows? I would hyper focus on an essay, right? Stay up, I would do my essay the night before, and I would get an A on that essay, and that was just that's how I got by. That was fine. It was like if you're familiar with, or if your audience is familiar with parts work and IFS, I think that there's a real strong protector part of me that achieves through school, through education, through writing, through those kinds of things. And that part would just kind of take over, do what needed to be done, and then move along. Meanwhile, everything else was just, I mean,
Yeah, a hot mess.
who knows?
And
Yeah.
just to know what IFS is, interfamily systems.
Yeah.
And basically it says that we can compartmentalize, and
Yep.
and the whole process of this type of therapy, which I am trained in and I love, is that we can actually put away things that don't serve us. It's
Mhm.
not in denial, but we can put it away in a healthy way. And
Mhm.
so, but based on that, it teaches us about the different parts of, like you found success there on a deeply subconscious level. You were like, I can rock school. And a lot of kids, where we can never use grades as the benchmark of mental health, right?
Absolutely. And even I would say in high school, I was a high achieving kid. And that's
Yeah.
one of the hardest things looking back is I had one English teacher, and she's listed in my acknowledgments because she caught on to some of the things I was writing about and wrote me a note and was like, hey, if you ever need to talk, come see me. That inspired me to become a teacher. That was my first career, was teaching, because of that experience, because she saw me behind the mask that I was putting on for everybody else to achieve.
Yeah.
Again, firstborn female, right? Like, I'm trying to do everything I can to look okay on the outside, but inside it was awful. And I think that's so important for parents to see, is we do miss those kids. Now, my parents knew, because there's enough going on at home, that they're like,
Yeah.
she's not always okay.
Yeah. And then you
we
had the
miss that a lot.
shame. You had the shame,
Yes.
Erin, you talked about,
Yes.
that you were this preacher's kid,
Oh my gosh.
and
Yeah.
right, and things weren't openly talked about at the
Mhm.
time, even though you were talking about it at home. I think when I think about so many families, there's so much fear that we have as parents. Now you're a parent, and then you're like, this is the thing. This is the thing that's going to work, right? I'm sure your
Mhm.
parents felt like that, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And they tried. I mean, my mom was there through some of the darkest things. And there are things that I know I'll never even remember in the way that she remembers, right? Because as
Mm.
parents, we see things. It's that double hurt of, this is my child. This is also affecting me. And me, I was just in my own head, but also out of my mind. There was that trauma protection of, I would dissociate for a lot of things that happened to me, a lot of my experiences. And my mom couldn't. She was right there in it with me. It's a lot.
Talk about disassociation, because
Yeah.
it's actually something I rarely talk about on this
Oh, yeah.
show, and it happens a lot. Kids get labeled as ADHD inattentive or even
Uh-huh.
depressed, and they're disassociating from the stressor, right?
Yeah. It's
And
protection.
yeah, it's protection. And talk about,
Mhm.
like, when you say in that instance you disassociate, you're talking about you don't remember, but like in those times when you would disassociate, right? You probably were carb loading, and then the next thing you
Oh,
knew,
yeah.
you were like, an hour went by. What just happened? Like,
So
what was it like for you?
there's a name for it. My family called it the zone when I would check out. They'd be like, and I could hear them. It was like from far, far away, I would hear them say, oh, she's in the zone again, but I'd be somewhere else. And I remember doing this from a young age. I remember asking my mom and dad, I don't know how old I was, probably 7 or 8, going, do you ever feel like you're outside of your body?
Mm.
And they were like, what? And I asked my mom first. She said, your dad might understand what you're asking. Maybe ask him. And so again, that also not her fault, not my parents' fault, of course. But not that they're not going to listen to this anyway. I don't need to defend them. But it's like they had no clue what was going on with me. Had no,
No.
just like
And
like,
who are they
what
going
is
to
this
ask?
kid saying? Right. And there weren't resources for them, just as there weren't resources for me. So
Mm-mm,
yes, so
mm-mm.
dissociation is one of the most powerful protective things we can do with trauma, is it's to physically check out of our bodies to survive,
Yeah.
right? And so I think about, I had early life medical trauma, the lungs collapsing. That was a medical trauma that I probably checked out at that point, and that served me really well throughout. And so I would choose, reading would be a way to do that, or food, like you said, like I would just numb out with some food. And
Yeah.
we these are socially acceptable things that we kind of joke and talk about. But this would also happen when I'd be in the middle of a conversation with somebody. Up until a few years ago, like I've worked really hard on my trauma healing. I still catch myself doing it. Like my oldest, she's a psychology student. She'll check me on it, which is so funny. She'll be like, "Hey, you're dissociating." I'm like, "Dang it, I'm so sorry." And I noticed, so when I do that now, am I feeling overwhelmed? Is something creating some internal distress in my nervous system that's causing me to feel like I should check out? Because it'll happen in social settings where there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of stimulation, there's a lot of people talking at once. My nervous system goes, oh no, we're not safe. We're not safe right now. There's that hypervigilant response going, okay, there's too much going on. I don't know what to predict. I'm watching, picking up on these cues. I mean, my oldest child also jokes, do I have a touch of the tism, as she calls it, right? Do I have some autistic? Because it's like, I'm always watching, making sure, am I doing something socially acceptable or not? And when that gets overwhelming, boom, I check out and I will completely miss what's going on in the conversation.
Thank you for that. And I think that's really helpful. So just to understand, it can be very much a protective mechanism.
Yes.
And what Erin said that is so powerful that I don't want you to not hear, I really want you to hear it, is that we have to look back and we have to say, what's the trigger? Why is that happening?
Yep.
Because, even though disassociating, can be helpful, when it happens a lot, it's not, because you're checking out of your life.
Right.
And what people do in modern times is they're disassociating with video games, with binge watching on Netflix and all these other things. And the more you disassociate, the harder it is to connect, right?
It is.
And so,
and I think approaching that with curiosity instead of, my internal critic, my inner bully is really mean. And I think I used my bully to motivate me to get out of bed in the morning when I was young, to do the things that I needed to do. And at some point, I remember my therapist asking, she's like, do you really need that bully to tell you to be on time places? Because of course I'm like, I'm time blind. I could just never show up anywhere on time, whatever. Right. And she's like, what would happen if you just like sent that bully away? Like, oh, I don't know. I probably never show up anywhere on time. She's like, so you're an adult. Like, oh gosh, I'm an adult. Yeah. And it's that curiosity of, okay, these things that we're here to, whether it's that negative self-talk that happens a lot with kids who are struggling. I would say
a lot.
The saddest things for me with our neurodivergent kids is how it makes me really emotional, actually, is that they are so mean to themselves and then they get it from the outside. And it's just, it breaks my heart because that was me. It's like, I would hear these like, just focus. Why don't you focus? Or why are you so clumsy? That's another thing, right? That's another part of neurodivergence, is just this clumsiness. But that becomes your narrator. That becomes how you're narrating your life. And so that dissociation, the inner critic, inner bully, these things that we do that we get really mad at ourselves for, I think approaching that with curiosity and compassion. And we have incredible research actually about even the gut microbiome. One of my favorite research studies that I put in my book because I was so fascinated by it is that when we see on a GI map test, which is a gut microbiome analysis test, right? When we see low secretory IgA on a stool test that has to do with your immune response, your gut barrier function, and that your immune response of your gut is just not working optimally. It's depleted. It can leave you open to attack and food sensitivities and poor immune function, all these kinds of things. Well, what they have shown in studies is that when that secretory IgA is low, it can come from fear and frustration. It comes from just that constant negativity or that constant hypervigilant nervous system state, that hyper awareness of, oh gosh, am I okay? What's wrong with me? Why am I, that negative self-talk? And then they also saw in these studies that when they increased care and compassion, it increased that secretory IgA, which I think is so huge. The fact that our brain and our immune system, we know this, they are in cahoots. Every signal your brain is sending to your body is picking up on and adjusting to help you survive.
And I think what people don't realize, like, we're here talking about this because everyone thinks a pill is going to fix it, right? And what we're saying is, no, that's not always the case. And in fact, I'm saying that with my population, it's pretty much never the case. And, when we think about neurodivergent kids, right, they have 10 times more likelihood of anxiety and depression.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's a lot of pressure they put on themselves. It's a lot of parents and people around them overcorrecting them. There's a way, right? So, you know, in my regulation first parenting, it's regulate, connect, correct. We can't process if we're not regulating. And we are that anchor for our kids. It doesn't have to look perfect, but it needs to happen. And you are in such an activated state, right? When you're talking about the gut, people don't realize, like, oh, if I regulate, my gut starts working better. Oh, when my gut starts working better, I reduce my sugar cravings. My neurotransmitters are working better. I can have increased dopamine. Like, all these pieces start working. When you got to college, right, and you were really trying to make it, like, when did you start realizing, like, first you're band-aiding it the whole time? Like, you look like functional, but in the inside, you're negative. Your parents are aware. I'm assuming people close to you are sort of aware. But when did you say, like, what is going on? Like, I'm doing all this stuff, nothing's working. How did that happen?
It's kind of crazy the way that it happened. And it's almost a little too hard to believe, but I was super self-destructive throughout college, and it put me into even more traumatic situations that of course I had to deal with later. But I was angry with myself, angry with my body, angry with my brain. And so I would drink to pass out. That led to assault and all sorts of terrible situations that I've since processed, and really grateful for healing that can come from for parents, because this does happen also to young girls who are struggling, right? They find substances and they find themselves in situations that you've got assault, you've got shame, you feel like you are the villain instead of the victim. I mean, I have a whole lot of that in my book as well, because that's really painful for parents to understand. Why did you put yourself in that situation? Anyway, all to say, so one of my situations when I was blackout, passed out, drunk, landed me with a surprise pregnancy. And in that pregnancy, so at that time I was taking Depakote. I think I was taking 500 milligrams, which is a pretty good sized dose. I was also on Zoloft, and they told me, you are going to have to get off of that. I mean, that Depakote leads to major birth defects if you're on that way to pregnant. So you're going to have to go off of that. I went off of that. While I was pregnant, I experienced almost like I would say a complete remission of my symptoms. I did not have mental health symptoms when I was pregnant. So I don't know if it was this autoimmune factor, because we see this with autoimmune disease, right? The immune
totally
system changes to protect the pregnancy. And so I think that there's that autoimmune factor. I think there's something hormonally that plays a role there, but also just being completely free of the medication that might have been, in many cases, and I say this delicately, I experienced psychosis with the THC, with marijuana, but I also experienced psychosis because of some of the medication they put me on. I remember at one point they switched my meds and I saw dead bodies in a corner, and I'm like, this is not right. There's something going on here. And that's something we have to be alert for. And so I just, again, say that delicately, because I know we're always, we do the best that we can with the information we have at the time. That was the information we had, is that I needed medication.
And that was your experience. I mean, I'm going to tell you, Erin, that I've had many clients have psychosis as a result of psychiatric medications, including ADD medications. So this is just sharing of information. Always work with your provider when nobody's telling you to come off meds. We're just, when you know better, you can do better. And there's actually many things we can do to reduce negative symptoms and really change the biological terrain of the nervous system, which is where you want to put your investment of time and money. And people aren't talking about that, but we are.
Right. So we are talking about that. Yes. And that created, that time period of pregnancy created a lot of regulation, because I cut myself off from everything that had been going on. At that point, I didn't know if I was going to choose adoption, because that was an option for me. I know a lot of really amazing adoptive agencies in my area. That was in the works. That we were talking about that because I didn't know, was I stable enough to raise a child on my own, right? Or if I was going to raise her as my own. I had all these things that I was working through, and it was an incredible experience. I had, even though I did grow up in this tight-knit religious community, everybody just welcomed me with open arms. I had like 3 or 4 different baby showers. People just came alongside me and supported me. And I was extremely supported in that process. And think about how that regulates the nervous system when co-regulating with you, that I was met with. And I know that's not the case for everybody. And I know a lot of people have been through terrible experiences and they're met with judgment and criticism. That was just not my experience. I was met with grace and support and love and care. And that completely changed the trajectory of everything going forward. I was able to move to a bigger city from East Texas to Dallas, and I had to get it kind of break away from where I was, which was great. I pursued my teaching certification because at that point I had made it through college. When I graduated, it was literally like the week before I graduated college is when I found out I was pregnant. So I made it through college fine. I was able to graduate, with a decent GPA. And then I went into teaching, and teaching brought a lot of stability because I love kids. I love supporting other people. So again, these things that now looking back, I'm like, these were regulating to my nervous system. Having a child and putting all of that, I will say up here, but after I weaned her and started my period again, a lot of my symptoms came back. That was very interesting.
So interesting.
It was like after the breastfeeding was over.
Hormone imbalance was a part of your mental health crisis.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks like that.
And think of the immune system support when you're breastfeeding. There's like just all sorts of crazy, amazing.
And you get so many dopamine hits when you're breastfeeding. And
for sure.
Yeah. There's a lot of good stuff that happens in the, in terms of biology when you're breastfeeding. And it makes sense. Right.
It does. And so I don't want to say that everything was fine after I had my daughter. Like I did struggle again. I was put back on medication, and then I started doing a little bit more digging about nutrition and movement. Exercise became my Adderall, right? Exercise became my dopamine stimulator because it is. And that really
it does so much.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We can talk about the myokines. We could talk about like all of the cool.
But even just the clinical benefits of exercise, like when you just for the real world of like what happens with your kids, it's not just visual motor, sensory motor. You social communication gets better, nonverbal social communication. Your attention improves. Like this is all research. I mean, there's so many neurological benefits that have nothing to do with meds. And, they've done it with martial arts. They've done it with just vigorous activity. They've done it with dance. So there's so many ways that, it
and I started running. I'm not a runner. I never was a runner, always hated it, but I started running and I felt soothing with that bilateral. So if we think about even from like an EMDR standpoint, right, that bilateral stimulation, how that can be helpful for people. And so, that really set me on a path to go, okay, well, what else could be beneficial? Because this is working for me. And so it was slow. And I want to make sure people understand this. It's always this. We want the quick fixes, right? Like I have a chapter in my book called Looking for a Magic Fix, because we want that one thing that's going to make everything go away. And that's just not how it's been for me. And now we're talking about, hey, I'm 44 and in perimenopause, and that shifts things again. And I'm doing everything I can, using every tool in my toolkit to make sure I'm supported, because I know what my first puberty was like. So I don't want second puberty to be like this too.
Yeah.
And so I think, but it is these tiny little baby steps, maybe add in some movement, maybe some hydration, some water instead of the Gatorade, instead of the soda, instead of as a mom, these are things that I'm thinking, okay, what are little things I can do for my kids? Because they're getting to the age, my younger ones, they're 11 and 8, and they're exposed to so much at parties and at school and all these things. Like, okay, what can I do at home to make sure they're supported as best as I can? And I understand, yes, sensory issues, texture issues, and we have things like ARFID that a lot of kids are struggling with. So how can I support them with supplements? What can I add in supplementally? Like, is it omega-3s? Is that a possibility? Or magnesium? I know you're a big fan of magnesium.
Yeah.
There are little things we can do if our kids aren't going to be, and it's so hard to say this, because I know a lot of people say, no, you should be getting this through food, but we're not. And a lot
we're
of
not.
people are not.
But you still should eat as healthy as possible, right? You and I are both like, I consider myself a level 9 eater. I'm still, dairy and gluten-free, minimal sugar, but I'm not 100% organic, right? That's a level 10, right? And so because, I'm going to eat out at a restaurant, right?
Totally.
Some people I know won't even eat out at a restaurant. They need everything to be grass-fed. But even within that, I take very purposeful supplements based on what I know that I need. But when we talk about this, right, I think why do people go to, medication? And I'm in all these Facebook groups. I know you are too. And, people are like, write things like, what meds stop dysregulation? That's literally what everybody is writing. And, there isn't a magic pill for that, right?
Mhm.
So what we want to do is we want to regulate the nervous system. We can have a whole conversation. You can go back and you can listen to these episodes. I'll make sure that people add it in. And you regulate first before we try to do learning and teaching.
Yeah.
And there's many ways to skin a cat. I got my PMF right here. We can use PMF. We can use neurofeedback. We can use prayer. We can use meditation. We can use breath work. We can use diet. We can use supplements. We can do all these things. And guess what? I do all those things, not just one. And I don't want to overwhelm people, but start with something. Start with breath. Start with maybe somatic, where I teach everybody about, a heart hug, do it for 30 days. Don't expect a miracle to happen. Oh, I did it. Well, I'm like, how many days did you do it? Oh, I did it for 2 days. I didn't notice anything. Well, guess what? It's not the way that the learning occurs in that body. But, so we talk about these things to be, hopeful for parents who are really struggling. And I think what's so poignant about your story is like, your story is going to sound very familiar to a lot of people. Maybe it's not a bipolar diagnosis. Maybe it's ADHD. I mean, I went to a thing last night at my son's he's transferred. I mean, he's going to high school. So it's a new school. And, right away, I get this mom, she's like telling me her kid, is on an IEP. He has chronic Lyme, but the doctor says, hey, this is such a bologna and cheese, says to her, an MD, infectious disease, says, oh, the great part about having Lyme disease is you can never get it again. And I'm like,
oh my.
What? Like, it almost makes you want to get his name and file against its license, but there's nothing you can do about it. But as you get out into the world, the point of this story is there's a lot of misinformation, and we're here to give you, what does the science say? And also really to help understand, this was not a positive experience for you. And I'm sure your parents are probably, I know you're very close to them and they couldn't be more supportive. Like when they look back, what would they have done differently? And speaking directly to parents who are considering medicating their kids or maybe are on psychiatric meds, like, what do you want them to understand how it felt for you? I think it's so critical because, they need to hear it out of somebody who's lived it. And by the way, on my YouTube is filled with people who were medicated as kids begging for them to not medicate their kids. And so kudos to people who speak up about it. And if you're on meds and they're working for you, God bless.
Totally. And that's fine. If that works for you, that's great. Nobody's saying get off your meds, but for me, it wasn't the solution. It didn't make things better. And I think what I wish that was more understood is that in these situations, I was not choosing any of this. And there was no way for me I needed somebody to teach me to regulate, right? And I think that's really important as parents. We've got to teach our kids how to regulate because they're not going to be able to teach themselves. They're just going to keep getting more wrapped up in this threat mode. And that would be the question too, is like, where is the threat? When you see your child freaking out, to them, there's a real threat. It doesn't mean that it is real, but there's a real threat. Right. And I think that is so important when we're talking about some of these unexplainable behaviors, that it is complete HPA axis dysregulation. And so figuring out how to create safety and how to create connection. I mean, I think safety and connection are two of the biggest tools that we have as parents, is we can create that safety, create that connection. It comes at the expense of ourselves a lot of times. And I would say for my parents, like, I think that they have their own trauma to work through because of what I put them through. And I acknowledge that. And your kids who you're struggling with are going to acknowledge that one day too. That's just how it goes. Right. But it's nobody's fault. Nobody's at fault here. It's just now we have more tools than we had back in the 90s. And so finding out how to create the connection, how to create that safety in a dysregulated nervous system is huge, because there is a real threat every time a kid is having a fit. That is a real threat to them. So what's the threat? And even now I will assess that myself. Like, okay, what can I do to create? I'm feeling off. What's going on? Curiosity, compassion. Why do I feel a threat right now? I don't know. It's okay. I'm going to breathe through it. Right. It's like just talking yourself through these things. And so to teach our kids that, but it does have to start with us, because if we don't learn these things, our kids are for sure not going to learn it.
No. And, I think the thing that there's so much power in, what you just said, I think a lot of us are like, what's going on? Why is this happening? Once the
Yeah.
nervous system starts activating and it gets compounded stressors, real, imagined,
Mhm.
perceived, whatever it is,
Mhm.
then their nervous system starts moving in that activation all the time, right?
Yep.
And we are not born regulated.
Right.
We learn to regulate, and then we learn coping skills. We learn ways to navigate, problem solve, figure things out, and deal with stressors, because our kids will have stressors. And,
Mhm.
we know our neurodivergent population is more sensitive, right?
Mhm.
Some of that
Absolutely.
sensitivity can be really harnessed in amazing ways. Like I have some, like I have a couple film producer friends that are autistic, and they've like harnessed it into this
Mhm.
amazing, they're like make these amazing movies, right?
Yeah.
But in the real world, we have to get through it, right? And so, the power of co-regulation is something parents are just learning they have. And
Mhm.
parents say to me all the time, how can I regulate when I'm there? He's dysregulating me. Well, guess what? You can. And
Yep.
you try to regulate when you're not dysregulated. Like you try to do it in the
Yes.
moments in between, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the biggest thing that I'm doing right now just to regulate myself, because it is a really busy time period for me,
Yes.
is I'm waking up earlier, and I love waking up early. That's me. It doesn't work for everybody, but it's for
Yeah.
me. I'm journaling for 20 minutes and I'm brain dumping everything that I'm feeling. And then I'm taking 10 minutes to do tapping, butterfly taps, whatever it is, breathing, breath work, reading some scripture, like doing things that I know is nourishing for me. And I'm trying to start my day off regulated, because that's not my default. I love a good jolt of adrenaline in the morning. I do love running late. Why? Because it gives me the dopamine, the adrenaline, the things that are a little bit of a struggle for my body to produce sometimes. And so I love starting out going, I am going to choose, this is my choice, choose to start regulated instead of my default, which is to start in a rush, start with a bang, right? Because that really hasn't always been beneficial for me or my family. So I'm doing that, and it makes my days go a lot better.
Yeah. It's good to know what you need. And I think, like, for those of us that have multiple kids, we know that our kids need different things, right? But your base can be this regulation for you all
Yep.
instead of moving, right? I talk about co-dysregulation, and we need to move to
That's so
co-regulation.
true.
And
That's a real
it's
thing.
easy for that to happen in modern parenting. Like, I want to say, like, you've said, like, oh, it was different in 1991. Well, I've been practicing, I've been in mental health since 92. And I'm going to tell you, Erin, it's not dramatically different. The
So
people,
sad. Yeah.
physicians, therapists say the same
Yep.
dumb shit that they
Yep.
did back then. And they will ignore research, like they will just spout things off. And, the research is very clear. It is not just genetics that cause
Right.
ADHD. I don't want to say ADHD, attention problems, right?
Mhm.
Mood disorders, all these other things. There are a
Mhm.
lot of factors. You talked about nutrient deficiencies, neuroinflammation, infectious triggers. How about trauma, right? And our idea of
Absolutely.
trauma, it's each person's view of trauma is different. You did experience a medical trauma,
Mhm.
when you were a child. And it doesn't mean that somebody has experienced something traumatic and their body is holding it. Everyone is unique. We know that the more regulated you are, the more protected you are from trauma.
Yes.
I say this all the time. I worked with 9/11 survivors. I worked with Sandy Hook survivors. You could see who is different. What you bring
Mhm.
to the table helps you get through hard times, right? And, I would say that, when you're, really thinking about this as a parent, again, this is an idea. This is helping you to understand your dysregulated kids, whether they're understimulated and they have learning and processing problems and focus problems, or they're ragers, they're overstimulated, or their mood goes in up and down, or they're a mix. Everyone always says, I have a mix. What would you say now as a parent, as an adult who's really living a very healthy life, and mentally well? I mean, you're just such a chill person. Like when I learn about your
Thank you,
history,
dear.
people go like, what? What? Like they
Mhm.
have a hard time connecting. That's because mental health doesn't discriminate, right? It can happen to anybody, just like addiction. So we just have to get to those root causes. What would you say, you know, as your final, what would you say to parents who are unsure about how to help their child, or they're being pushed by the school, which is technically illegal, or you know, their physician, or their mental health practitioners? People will go to mental health practitioners and somebody will say, I'm not going to see you unless you're medicated. You'll have to find another practitioner. They get bullied into things. So in these situations, or maybe that's just not the case, it's been offered to them.
I think one of the things that we can often do as parents when we're desperate is we can kind of give over our parenting power to the experts, and we can learn to distrust our own instincts. And we have neurons in our gut that connect to our brain for a reason. That gut feeling you have that something isn't right is probably something you need to listen to, you know? And I think because we get desperate or we get exhausted. And I think that's a really real thing, is when we have kids who are dysregulated. And I have one of my own is very much like me when I was younger. And I fight for that kid so hard because I know that he doesn't mean to be that way. I know there's so many other things going on, and I know it's exhausting. And so for parents who are going through this exhausting battle, we want to give it over to somebody else, because just somebody help me with my kid, right? But to also remember that you know your kid best. You really do. And it's hard to remember that sometimes when we're in that struggle, when we are in that desperate place. But to keep advocating for yourself, your own nervous system, keep advocating for your child's nervous system, and that nervous system regulation, whether it's HPA axis dysfunction, neuroinflammation caused by that, whatever it is, generational trauma, which is a whole other thing, but that's happening in the hypothalamus at the same time, right? So we have that. We can do tiny things at home to create more of a supportive environment. And that power is in our hands. And we don't have to, we can give away a little bit of power to the extent of like, gosh, there are great resources out there to get some help. But we need to keep most of our power in our own hands because we know our kids best. That's what I would say.
I love this so much, and so much of what you just left off with is what my next book is about, which coming out in 2026. But you know, we're both following the science of dysregulation and getting people to think differently. And thank you so much for sharing so many personal things, because you know, people still feel ashamed to be struggling, and that should be long gone. But we live in a place, as I like to call it, fake book, where everyone seems like things are going right. But I'm here to tell you that's just not the case. And so if you're struggling, if your child is struggling, go to get help with somebody who really is aligned with you and your gut, and learn the strategies, because I call it parenting power. It's parenting power. We are the most powerful influence on our kids' lives. Even when we feel like we don't know what the hell we're doing, you can get that guidance, and you can find an aligned practitioner that can really open the door. But thank you so much for sharing your story. And I can't wait to read this book. I can't wait for this to impact people and really start changing the conversation about medicating our kids first. It shouldn't be the first thing. We need to dig deeper, and we need to regulate the nervous system.
Exactly. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you.
Want more insights and solutions? Well, subscribe to our Dysregulation Insider, and it will show up in your inbox every week.